Welcome to this video presentation in the series Being Transgender, in which we look at different aspects of this condition to help people better understand it. My name is Steph Polak, and in this particular video I will be looking at the biology of sex and gender and addressing the considerable misunderstanding and misinformation that exists and persists within our societies about these. When we talk about biology, we're talking about the rules of nature, which, due to our predisposition to oversimplify, our ideologies, or simply a lack of knowledge, often differ considerably to those we commonly believe and claim to be nature's. Diversity is a good example of this. We view conformity as good and diversity as bad, and commonly describe natural diversity using words like abnormal or disorder. But in nature there is no right or wrong, good or bad, and diversity is in fact fundamental to life. Mixing things up and creating diversity is what has driven and continues to drive evolution. And without diversity, life wouldn't exist or have survived on Earth. Us humans owe our existence to diversity, and just as our past required diversity, so our future relies on us embracing and respecting our individual uniqueness and diversity. Our common beliefs on sex and gender also tend to be at odds with nature and diversity. For example, if you are a slime mold, you can be one of over 100 sexes. There is nothing in nature that says there are only two sexes, and slime mold are one of a number of organisms that have multiple sexes. On the other hand, if you are a gecko, you are all female and reproduce without sex. You simply lay eggs. You can still reproduce sexually and occasionally mate with closely related species, but have basically given up on males. You belong to a whole group of species that can and do reproduce asexually, or both sexually and asexually. For sea turtles, your sex is determined by the temperature your eggs were incubated at. Above 30 degrees C, and you'll all be female. Below 28 degrees C, you'll all be male. And in between, well, you'll be a mixture. Like many species, there are a range of complex factors that determine your sex. If you are a clownfish, a Nemo, you change sex. Clownfish live on reefs as a monogamous male and female pair, often with a group of juvenile males. Should the female be lost, the male changes sex and becomes the female, and one of the juveniles steps up to become her partner. Clownfish are one of a number of species that are either both male and female, or can change sex, male to female to male, or backwards and forwards as appropriate. There is nothing in nature to say sex is immutable. If you are a human, you can be sexed as female at birth and brought up as a girl. But when you reach puberty, grow a penis and testicles, and live out the rest of your life as male. In the region where this is common, these children are known as guavadoches, which literally means penis at 12. With seahorses, it is the male who gets pregnant. You receive the eggs, fertilize and gestate them, and give birth, which is all cool with nature. Finally, if you are a white-throated sparrow, you have two sexes, but have evolved such that your natural parental behaviours have been divided into two distinct groups. You can be part of the group of males and females that do the foraging and protect the airspace around the nests, or you can be part of the group that tends the chicks and nests. Your species has evolved two sexes, but 4 genders, which leads us to ask, what do we mean by gender? Well, there are numerous definitions for gender, commonly stating gender to be a uniquely human social construct, or using words like intersection. But these definitions generally fail to fully and coherently explain what we see and experience in nature, such as our white-throated sparrow. Given this, the definition I'm going to use here is that gender is the identity image and associated role behaviours hardwired into our brains by our biology. Essentially, gender is part of the vast library of hard-coded software functions that are created and run in our brains by our biology. For us, this gender software has variants, a boy variant or girl variant, a mixture of these, or something in between, and provides us with two important functions: our gender identity, who we see ourselves as, including a sexual identity, which we constantly reference, and our gender personality, the set of inherent behaviours that we use to support our gender role in the world. We then use and combine these to give us what is called our gender presentation, how we then present ourselves and interact with the world around us. We all have these, even if they are so deep-seated that we are not consciously aware of them, and they give rise to a huge range of presentations: tomboy girls, camp males, and so on. This also fits with our right-throated sparrow. Of course, what this means is that sex and gender are very different biological attributes. Our sex is the hardware elements that we use to procreate and produce children. Our gender is the software suite running in our brain that determines who we are and our role and place in the world around us. That many societies confuse the two is because they make an assessment of a baby's sex at birth and then assume that baby has a particular variant of the gender software. This is fine for those whose gender reasonably matches that assumed, and they probably never give it a moment's thought. But it can cause huge issues for those where this assumption turns out to be incorrect, especially when societies conflate gender and sex, use the words interchangeably, or have laws and ideologies that are based on the belief the assumption is always correct. Because, while sex and gender are both biologically hardwired, they have very different and separate biological development processes. That means the assessments and assumptions we make are not a given and can in fact turn out to be badly flawed. Now, if these are both biological attributes, we need to be able to trace an evolutionary path for each, as well as sexuality, and give plausible reasons for their evolution. For this we need to go back over 3,500 million years, to shortly after the Earth was formed, and the chance creation of the molecule of life, deoxyribonucleic acid, or as we call it, DNA. DNA has three amazing properties. Firstly, it is made from two sets of molecule pairs called base pairs that can be built in any sequence into strings billions of pairs long that look rather like a binary code. Secondly, these strings can replicate by splitting themselves down the middle and recreating the missing side. Thirdly, they can be prized apart between certain points in the exposed strip, called a gene, used as a template to create other molecules, which in turn are used to build cells and ultimately bodies. Initially, DNA created nothing more than a vast number of asexual simple and single-cell organisms. But about 1,200 million years ago, some of these single cells started to share, merge and use multiple strings of DNA, and sex was born. The reasons for this are not completely clear, as sharing means you are not passing on all of your DNA. But it has been suggested it was an effective way of protecting and repairing damaged DNA as it became more complex, and that it made it easier for organisms to adapt to difficult and changing environments. Sex also helped more complex multicell organisms to evolve, and that eventually required new ways of delivering and combining DNA, leading to the evolution of sperm, eggs, pollen. It also meant offspring took longer to develop and mature, so methods of gestation were required, leading to the evolution of seeds, eggs and wombs, followed by methods of supporting rearing, pouches and milk. And our little gecko? Well, she went back and cut out all the faff with sex and mating, and returned to asexual reproduction. So here we see the evolution of the physiology we call sex. On the other side, about 550 million years ago, specialized cells called neurons evolved, which provided rapid communication between cells over wide distances. This enabled actions to be coordinated within and between disparate cell groups, and enabled better responses to external inputs, such as dangers. This led to the evolution of nervous system and brains, and early on a hardwired gender identity, which gave organisms the ability to recognize, from the off, themselves, who they could and couldn't mate with, or who were threats and food, so improving survival and reproductive success. As neurological evolution continued and as maturity times increased, so gender role behaviours and parental behaviours were required and evolved, which ultimately led to the evolution of social behaviours and social structures, all of which increased survival and reproductive success through shared support. So here we see the evolution of neurology and the inherent behaviours we call and associate with gender. But then, as life became more diverse and complex, so finding a mate became more difficult and competitive, especially when simply being able to identify who one could mate with was no longer an advantage. So inherent attraction and mate selection behaviours evolved on the neurological side, which then drove evolution in species to create all sorts of strange and wonderful physical characteristics and intrinsic behaviours. For example, the male peacock's tail display may look amazing to us, but its purpose is to wow the peahens, and only the very best will cut the mustard with them. The bowerbird goes to extreme lengths to build and decorate an extraordinarily complex bower just to attract a mate, who will only be attracted by the very best. So here we see the evolution of what we know as sexuality. Attraction has also been used by species in unusual ways to enhance reproductive success. For example, perfume and flowers have evolved in plants to attract insects, who then collect and disperse their pollen. And as social behaviours evolve, so different types of natural social structure emerged. In particular, pair bonding species, such as gibbons, where a male and female pair bond to share the role of offspring rearing and family welfare. And tournament species, where those of one sex compete for dominance over all the others in the social group. Tournament species can be patriarchal, with males competing for overall dominance, as with baboons, or matriarchal, with females competing for overall dominance, as with lemurs. The development of these social structures has then driven physical and behavioural evolution changes in these species. The cute meerkat and the somewhat less cute naked mole rat both live in matriarchal societies, and the females are not only physically larger than males, but more aggressive, and will sometimes fight to the death to be queen. With deer, it's the other way round, with the male deer being the larger and having the big antlers that they use when rutting for dominance. Pair bonding species, on the other hand, require very little physical sexual dimorphism. though there may be significant behavioural differences depending on how the gender roles are divided. For example, the male marmoset takes complete responsibility for the babies from birth to maturity. So, although interrelated, sex, gender and sexuality are clearly three different attributes with distinct and separate evolutionary paths. And as for us humans, well, we sit in the middle somewhere between pair bonding and tournament species. This is why we don't have much in the way of sexual dimorphism, but do have the most complex set of social behaviours, societies and gender characteristics. Because if we plot human gender identities against numbers off, we get a single curve with two peaks, a bimodal spectrum that is clearly not binary. However, some societies divide this curve on purely ideological grounds into two gender groups, a male and female binary, into which everyone is required to fit. But there are a significant number of people for whom this doesn't work, such as those whose gender fits across the divide, and in recognition of this, the greater majority of other societies divide this curve differently. 3 divisions or genders is the norm, but some Native American societies recognize as many as 5 gender groups. Whatever the divisions, each society then applies a set of cultural customs to these groups. Rights, rules on presentation, assumed behaviours and interests, and so on, which are impressed on the members of that society from birth. For Western societies, this is also reinforced in their languages, which, unlike many others, systematically use gendered words such as pronouns. But these cultural customs are not fixed, and as societies change over time, so the customs change. For example, it was pink for a boy and blue for a girl at the start of the 20th century, but the opposite by the end of it. This partitioning of the gender spectrum and application of associated cultural customs, how these then change and reflect the ongoing pull between patriarchal, matriarchal and pair bonding societies, provide an enormously rich set of social constructs for study, debate and discussion. So rich, in fact, that we lose sight of the biology that underpins them and start claiming these constructs are gender. But gender itself is not a social construct. It is a biological, neurological attribute that exists throughout nature. Only the division of the gender spectrum and the application of cultural rules are social constructs. But how do transgender people fit into this? Well, as explained earlier, we assume that the gender app that is installed in our brains by our biology is intrinsically tied to our physical sex and, as a result, assign a gender based on an assessment of sex at birth. But it is clear this assumption is flawed, and that some people's biology has installed a gender app that is very different to that assumed. Their genders may be on the other side of the spectrum, and so are transgender, or somewhere in the middle and are non-binary. Considerable scientific research has been conducted into the nature of this, which overwhelmingly confirms a biological basis for gender and transgender identity. For example, we have recently identified the anterior precuneus in our brains as playing a significant role in our self-identity, while multiple studies of twins, those born intersex, brain structure scans, behavioural analysis including brain scans, studies on the effects of hormones and drugs, all provide irrefutable evidence. Research has also shown that our identities are established by the age of 3, and how hugely complex biological development processes are that make these variances possible, and why gender is therefore not the sex of the brain. Our sex develops early in gestation, our brains considerably later, and all are driven by genetics and epigenetics, including hormones. Even our white-throated sparrow has been shown to have small biologically created brain differences that determine which gender role they take. Research has also been undertaken to see if, rather than being biological, transgender identity is a belief that is acquired due to social conditioning, an ideology with a psychosocial cause. However, none of these have provided any evidence for this, while the few theories put forward, autogynephilia and social contagion, have rapidly and repeatedly been disproven. The huge base of evidence of transgender individuals existing across human history, cultures, geographies and ideologies makes this highly improbable. In short, all the evidence shows a biological etiology for gender and transgender identity. Oh, it also explains why you can't identify as a horse or whatever. You need a horse's biology and brain. The complexity of the biology involved, though, has resulted in a lot of falsehoods being perpetuated in society about sex differentiation and how brains work. At the turn of the 20th century, scientists looking into their microscopes saw X-shaped strands of matter arranged in pairs in the nucleus of human cells. They didn't know what these were or what they did, but did notice that in males the last strand looked more like a Y. This was postulated as an explanation for sex differentiation, and seized on by those with certain ideological and religious beliefs. Here was the proof that God had made man and woman, and they had XY and XX chromosomes respectively. However, scientists then started to find anomalies. People with XXY or XXX chromosomes, and many other combinations. People who didn't have a final X or Y, or had both XX and XY cells, as well as that other animals had different types of chromosomes. Chromosomes clearly weren't what defined sexual differentiation, but what did? Although DNA had by then been isolated, it took a while for scientists to recognize what DNA was, and that chromosomes were made from it, though the person who'd first isolated DNA scoffed at the idea. As our knowledge grew of how DNA, fertilization and cell division worked, so we started to understand and identify the role of genes. The SRY gene on the Y chromosome seemed to trigger male sexual development. But then, this wasn't always found on the Y chromosome, but was sometimes on the X, or could be missing from either X or Y, leading to some males being XX and some females being XY. We now know there are a whole range of genes, not simply the SRY gene, involved in sexual development. How these genes are controlled, the field of epigenetics, therefore became important. Estrogen and testosterone and their derivatives, known as the sex hormones, have been shown to play an important role in this. While our bodies produce both, varying levels throughout our lives impacts sex characteristics and development. The molecules are remarkably similar though, and in fact testosterone converts down into estrogen in some parts of the body, which males use to determine and control testosterone levels. But the epigenetic mechanisms are extremely complex, and hormones only play a part. This has ultimately led us to understand that sex actually exists on a spectrum, with 2% of people being born with intersex characteristics or forms of hermaphroditism. We have also identified various syndromes that give rise to variable sex characteristics. Androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS, results in testosterone being unable to bind to its receptors, so cannot play its role in development, while MRKH syndrome results in female sex organs, wombs, ovaries and vaginas being severely underdeveloped or completely missing. And most recently we have started to unearth biological mechanisms that result in mammals such as us changing sex. So human sex biology is hugely complex and variable, not defined by XX and XY chromosomes, and not seemingly immutable. It exists on a spectrum, with intersex people existing in significant numbers. The division of this spectrum into male and female is therefore a social construct, with each division being impossible to define. But the myths about chromosomes, sex binaries and sex immutability continue to be inserted and believed. We also find similar societal misunderstandings about our brain and its workings. When prominent British physician Thomas Willis postulated in 1652 that the brain was responsible for thought, with ideas moving from the outer to the inner layers, leading academics of the time scoffed. External spirits controlled thought and behaviours and communicated with us through the pineal gland. We have come a long way since then and now recognise the brain as being the most complex object we know of in the universe, made of over 100 billion neurons, with each neuron having up to 10,000 synaptic connections with other neurons, using more than 10 different neurotransmitters to communicate. We have begun identifying different areas wired to undertake specific functions. The amygdala for emotion, the insular cortex for taste and smell, the visual cortex. But our understanding is still limited, and much of what we do know has only been discovered in the past 50 years. We have also discovered we are born with just about all the neurons we'll ever have, but very few synaptic connections, and spend the first 3 years of our lives developing amazingly complex synaptic networks, before spending the rest of our lives pruning and managing these. While our experiences influence the formation of these networks, and therefore our behaviours, the question is, to what degree is that early development driven by those experiences, and is therefore learnt, and how much is driven by genetics, and is therefore hardwired? In short, how much is nature, how much nurture? Now, the prevailing theory during the mid-20th century, called behaviourism, believed the brain at birth was an empty box and that everything was learnt. You could not only explain every behaviour as the result of specific psychosocial inputs and experiences, but such was our confidence in the brain's neuroplasticity, we believed that, with the correct learning, you could make anyone into anything, a classical pianist or an Einstein. But those who were studying animal behaviour out in the field, ethologists, then showed that a huge number of animal behaviours could not have been learnt and had to be innate, hardwired by evolution and biology, and that these innate behaviours were only shaped by experience. For example, monkeys have innate warning calls, but learn from experience when best to use and not to use these. This fitted with our developing understanding of heritability, the measure of how much a behaviour or physical attribute is the result of genetics versus external influences. Those behaviours with high heritability scores were hardwired and less influenced by experience, and vice versa. It also changed our understanding and acceptance of neurodiversity. Up to the late 20th century, conditions like schizophrenia and autism were believed to have psychosocial causes. Our parents had hated us, or didn't show us sufficient love as babies. We now accept these and many others as being natural, biological hardwired conditions, to be understood and managed. So while society still perpetuates the belief in the supremacy of learnt behaviour and boundless neuroplasticity, it is now scientifically accepted that core behaviours are hardwired by evolution and cannot be changed, merely shaped by learning, even in us humans. As for gender and transgender identity, multiple studies have shown these to have a high heritability scores, and that even then the external influences are largely biologically hardwired. So while there may be those that claim being transgender is an acquired, learnt belief, an indoctrination that can be stopped and rectified, the evidence shows this is hardwired by our genetics and not learnt, and is therefore immutable and not significantly influenced by learning. As sex, gender and sexuality are all different attributes, so we use different sets of terms to describe each. For sex, we use male and female for the two social divisions, and intersex for those who are in the middle of the spectrum with varying sex characteristics. For sexuality, we use heterosexual for those attracted to the opposite gender, homosexual for those attracted to the same gender, with the variants lesbian and gay to describe specific same-gender attraction. Bisexuals are attracted to both the same and opposite gender, while pansexuals are attracted to all in the gender spectrum, including those who are non-binary. Asexuals, on the other hand, do not feel a particular attraction to any gender. For gender, we also use male and female, for those whose biological genders sit in the areas under the two peaks of the gender spectrum. Non-binary, for those who sit in the middle and across the societal division. Gender fluid, for those whose gender presentation fluctuates between either side. And agender for those who do not feel an association with any position on the gender spectrum. Cisgender is then used for those whose assigned gender matches their biological gender. Transgender for those whose assigned gender does not match their biological gender. We also have transsexual, which was historically used to specifically identify those who had fully transitioned, had gender-affirming surgery, and who could therefore obtain specific rights. However, the term has largely been deprecated, as it is somewhat inaccurate and confusing. There are also some more general terms: queer, as in unspecified, ally, a supporter of, questioning, still unsure. It is important to understand these and get them right. While we talk about the LGBT community, and while there may be crossover, we are talking about two distinct groups, and gender is not to be confused with sex or sexuality. Transgender people cover every sexuality. For example, a third of transgender women are and remain attracted to men, a third are and remain attracted to women, and a third are bisexual, asexual, or seemingly adjust their sexuality following gender transition. And, of course, a cisgender homosexual man is not the same as a heterosexual transgender woman, and though they are both attracted to men, they would not be attracted to each other. So what of numbers? Well, quantifying the percentage of the population that is transgender has proven difficult, as many keep their condition secret out of fear, or have still to come to understand or accept they are transgender. However, research suggests that around 1% of humans are transgender, with possibly 1 in 25 having some form of gender issue. And the number of intersex people, at 2%, is similar to those with red hair. The number of transgender men is roughly the same as transgender women, with fewer but a growing number of non-binary folk. Historical and archaeological evidence going back many thousands of years shows transgender people are far from new, and that some held high-ranking positions, including emperor. That the number of transgender people is currently growing is not due to some push in ideological indoctrination. It is, after all, impossible to make someone transgender, but because we have now far greater access to information, which helps us to better understand ourselves, while there is growing awareness and acceptance of the variance in biological gender identities. Attempts to suppress or eradicate transgender people on ideological grounds, therefore, can never succeed because, being biological, transgender people will always exist. So, in conclusion, being transgender is a very natural, normal biological condition. It is not an ideology, a learnt behaviour or acquired belief, any more than being autistic is an ideology or learnt behaviour. It is not tied to sex or sexuality, though it is regularly confused with these, and often deliberately so. It has been around for as long as humans, and is part of natural diversity, fundamental to evolution and life. Transgender people will always exist. And it is a condition that cannot be caught. You cannot be made to be transgender. You cannot choose or pretend to be transgender. And you cannot be converted from or cured of being transgender. In short, it's not a choice, not something you can become or turned into, nor a belief, but is something you are from day zero. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope it gave you some better understanding of the biology of being transgender. If you'd like to learn more, please do look out for the other videos in this series.